again, and welcome back to Module 1, which is an introduction to history. Module 1.1 in particular introduces us to different versions of history. The second question we have to tackle here is what is academic history? Now, here's a slide with three Filipino historians. The first one's name is Ambeth Ocampo, and he was one of the first Filipino public historians who basically popularized bringing history to Philippine pop culture through books and opinion columns and shows that would make history less academic and less boring and more palatable or appealing to the general public. Another historian we have featured here is the current dean of the College of Social Sciences, whose name is Leia Nkiwe Abayaw. So she's a UP Baguio historian who specializes in indigenous people in the Cordilleras and heritage conservation. And the third person who we kind of met in the previous segment, his name is Zeus Salazar. And he is known as the father of the historical school of thought called Pantayong Pananaw, which popularized the saying, salaysay na may saysay, para sa sinasalaysayan as history or kasaysayan. So these three people tell us that there are different ways to approach Philippine history, and it's an area that's very much alive and has been existing not only in the academe, but also in the wider public world of pop culture. So let's define academic history. What do people like Ambet Ocampo, Ma'am Leia Nkiwe Abayaw, and Zeus Salazar do? So history is a product of scholarly work, and it's created by professionals who are trained in something called historiographic methods. The term for the scientific study of history is historiography. And this includes the analysis of truth value in sources and the crafting of narratives which explain human change and continuity through time. The histories we read, therefore, are based on the arguments carefully constructed by historians. Like all kinds of empirical knowledge, these narratives are prone to change in light of the discovery of new sources and new methods of analysis. So let's focus on that word, historiography. This is the formal study of historical writing. This covers its philosophy, methods of constructing narratives from sources, and ways of critiquing the historical body of knowledge. The product, which is the historical narrative, is what we focus on as the output of historiography. Traditionally, a written work which embodies the arguments of a historian that explain the history of a topic of study. So that's what the historical narrative is. Yun yung nahanap nyo na sa libro, ganyan-ganyan. But there are more layers to this. We can also do a critique of different histories and how they're written in order to see which parts might be a little biased or which parts were not very well grounded in historical fact. So the objective of historiography is to establish historical facts or information verified by multiple authorities and accepted in the wider scholarly community. So hindi ito sabi-sabi lang o mga kwento na pinapasa-pasa lang. There is no such thing as history that simply exists. What do we mean by this? It can be confusing kasi alam natin na may mga kasaysayan naman na ibinabahagi sa atin through word of mouth. For example, family histories. And it doesn't mean that these histories did not happen. It just means that they're not academic histories yet. In the same way, na may mga kasabihan and like techniques that were taught in everyday life. For example, if you look up at the sky and it starts to gray, the clouds start to become very thick over the world, alam natin na okay, it's probably about to rain. So that can be folk knowledge with a basis of truth, but it's not necessarily a scientific approach yet. In the same way as with history, there are stories passed down with basis in truth, pero hindi pa sila fully na-verify at hindi pa sila nakakadaan sa scientific process. So when we talk about historiography and the product of the historical narrative, ito yung mga medyo na-verify na. Now, the historical argument and history as a narrative, so ito yung mga output ng historiography, will be tackled in more depth later. But for now, it will do to say that the historical argument is built on questions who, what, when, where, why, how, and so what, based on evidence we've collected and assessed for their truth value. What we produce is a narrative or a story which seeks to explain human responses to change and continuities through time. Now let's look at the historical argument for a bit. No? Yung definition natin dito, which is it's a story that focuses on who, what, when, where, why, how, and so what. It's something familiar to you if you're a student journalist, no? But there's also another way to frame these questions within something more structured as a historical narrative. So, yun yeah, who, what, when, where, how, so why, who, what, when, where, how, and so what. Kung titignan natin, the answers to those questions are actually categorized in different areas. We have contexts, causes, consequences, evidence or primary sources, and implications for later times. Now, individually, you're probably already going to know what these terms mean, but I just wanted to demonstrate how they fall into the structure of the historical narrative. Let's start with the two basic ways that histories are told. Here's our case study. Spanish colonization. Now you're probably familiar with Spanish colonization if you're called Maria and you were born into the Catholic faith. If at home you have certain fiestas that you like to celebrate in favor of patron saints in your bayan, and if you know where your local parishes are, all of these are effects of Spanish colonization in the Philippines. Now, if we talk about Spanish colonization as a period or something that happened in the past, we can think of that story in terms of causes and consequences. Cause. So, why did Spanish colonization happen? That's the cause, diba? So, the Spanish arrived in the Philippines and found important resources there. The consequence, or what happened after, was that the Spanish crown decided to colonize these islands and set up a government here to extract resources. Tapos sasanga-sanga na yung mga iba't ibang consequence, di ba? The Philippines becomes majority Catholic. They restructure the way of life here, and so on and so forth. We'll get to that later, no? When we reach the topic on Spanish colonization. For now, it's enough to say this is one version of the story. But when we're doing a historical type of argumentation, we have to push the story further. So, okay, i-connect natin sa who, what, when, where, how, why. So, what, who, the Spanish, and also the Filipinos. What, Spanish colonization. When, during the period of Spanish colonization. Why, because the Spanish arrived here and found important resources. So what? There were consequences, like the Spanish decide to colonize islands. But then we push the argument further and we say, okay, wait lang. Pero bakit ba dumating dito yung mga Spanish to begin with? And that's the context. So there are two contexts to the Spanish arrival in the Philippines, or very basic lang to, sketch lang to. We'll find out more about it later. So in Spain, the crown, through its own history, is able to collect a vast amount of resources from their defeat of their enemies, the Moors, which gives them funds to navigate the wider world. Kasi kung iisipin natin, colonization takes funds. Hindi naman pwedeng lalabas ka lang into the world and then you just magically have a ship and you just magically have a crew and all of the things you need to feed them and the salaries that you need to give them. That's not how it works. You need to have a vast amount of resources in order to find more resources. Now, that answers the question of how the Spanish arrived in the Philippines, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why the Spanish arrived here in particular. And the context of this is, in the Philippines, even before the Spanish arrived, we already had long-term trading relationships with places like China and Japan. And that meant that there were enough resources circulating here for us to be interesting to European conquerors such as the Spanish. And therefore, we lead into the next part okay, now I know the context for why the Spanish arrived and why they decided to stay here. But then we can push that even further. So you now know the context, you now know the cause, or you kind of have an idea of the cause and the consequence to Spanish colonization. But even if that's a really good story, the question is, how do we know it's true? The next level of analysis looks at evidence or sources, in particular, primary sources. So, what kinds of sources serve as evidence for the fact na nangyari nga talaga yung Spanish colonization? You have laws, letters, ships, coins, guns, fans, clothing, but also, and interestingly enough, language. The fact that in Filipino, when you want to ask someone how they're doing, you ask, "Kumusta?" which is our variant of "Como esta?", which is a Spanish phrase for "How are you?" Another very interesting manifestation of this is Chavacano, which is a language spoken, I think, in the area of Cavite. Or is it Davao? Okay, geography is a bit weak at this point. Pero if you know about that language, Chavacano, it's actually a mixture of Spanish and the local languages of that area. And it's spoken as one of the most unique languages in the Philippines. So that's a source. It's evidence for the fact of cultural intermixing brought about by Spanish colonization. But we can push the analysis even further by something we've already identified earlier. So, you know the context for why the Spanish arrived here, the cause of Spanish colonization, which is the decision to stay, the consequence, which is the colonization of the islands and the many, many consequences that came from that economically, politically, spiritually, and so on and so forth. We know that it's not just a random story and that it has basis in historical fact because of the sources. But more than that, we also know that there are implications for later times. For example, in the present day, even if this process happened hundreds of years ago, no, we're still majority Catholic, or at least on paper, we're majority Catholic. And because of that, religion tends to affect things like public policies and public opinion. For instance, we're one of the last countries to pass a divorce bill. It doesn't really necessarily matter what you and I feel about that. It's just a fact. Now, we're one of the last countries in the world to pass a divorce bill. And one of the reasons for that has been religious pushback against the concept. Another manifestation of this is public opinion on LGBTQ rights or the ability for same sex couples to get a civil union rather than just marriage. Diba? So the opinions on these matters may have different sources. Some people like to make biological arguments that have been largely debunked. But if you go to the root of it, really, the primary driving force between opinions defending certain values is religious. And those religious tendencies have, in a way, been a part of our heritage from the Spanish colonial era. So, this isn't a judgment about how good or bad those values are. No, it's just a fact of history at this point. Okay, so here are examples that you've already seen before. These are primary sources that came from the Spanish colonial era that tell us na nangyari talaga yung mga yung event na yon of Spanish colonization. So, how did the Spanish arrive here? They had ships called galleons. How did they interact with Filipinos? Some people were interested in making alliances and other people wanted to fight them. And one of the pieces of evidence from that is this Mindanaoan brass cannon that was often used on Mindanaoan ships called karakoas against yung galleons natin. We also know that the Spanish started to imagine different parts of the islands here as the Philippines through maps, for example, such as the 17th century Villaverde map. And we know that other people were able to arrive in the Philippines as well because they created images of the space. For example, this Dutch etching of Manila Bay was made because Manila was quite impressive to many Europeans at the time as a place that represented a vast amount of wealth happening through galleon trade. Items that were traded in that system include this coin, which is a 15th century Spanish royal peso. So those are examples of primary sources. No? So when you have collected your primary sources, we can look at the historical narrative as having several elements. So may framework tayo, itong context, cause, consequence, and evidence plus implications. But we also have three basic elements. You have temporality. You always have to know when a history is being written for. So in this case, Spanish colonization. Maybe you're not sure when the dates are right now, but that's okay. Basta alam natin na that's a period of time. You also have spatiality or the concept of space. Saan natin hahanapin or ipoposition yung kasaysayan na ito? No history exists outside of space after all. So when we talk about Spanish colonization, it's not the Spanish colonization of the Americas or the Spanish colonization of Guam. It's the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. Finally, we have to have a population involved. So, who was being colonized? It is the people who would later be called Filipinos, but really, they were part of many different ethno-linguistic groups that already existed at the time. The Kapampangan, the Tagalog, the Iloco, and many different ethno-linguistic groups from the Cagayan and the Visayas. So, another example of this, no, para makita natin yung applications ay, there's an article, and we saw that earlier, by William Henry Scott. It's called Filipinos in China Before 1500. So let's identify the subject, Filipinos, spatiality or the place, Filipinos in China, and the time span before 1500. Now, another core concept is the sources used in history. Now, although we have secondary and primary sources in all areas of scientific study, primary sources are defined a little differently in history. Now, let's begin with something that's already familiar to us. Like other areas of study, we look at secondary sources as written work that has already been published about the topic under study by the scholars or historical writers. So, histories written by trained historians typically have more authority than those written by unrecognized hobbyists and enthusiasts. So, for example, a TikTok history by some random person who's very interested in history might not be as authoritative as a history that you find written and published by an authoritative publishing company. So, in academic histories, one powerful way to retrace the evidence used to build the narratives, as we said, historical truth isn't just given. We don't wake up one day and say, in 1898, the Philippines was freed from Spain. That's not something that happens and we just know automatically. It's something that we have to learn about. And the sources that we use to learn about those facts have to be constructed by looking at the sources we've seen already, like these items. And then they have to be checked constantly. So, a powerful way for us to know that a historian or a history is actually based on evidence is through the footnote. Now, here's the power of the footnote. No, it's so powerful in historical articles. Now, often the footnote is larger than the text, and that's because they're trying to retrace all of the evidence they use to make certain claims. So it's not just one source; it's multiple sources. They can also reference other scholarly articles that have already discussed the topic. Now let's talk about primary sources, which are different in history from other sources of study. Now, these are texts and materials, so they're not just written work, but also other items, and we'll see that later. And they have to be produced during the time under study or contemporary to the period. So, if you're studying the Spanish period, your primary sources will be created in the Spanish period, or at least they tell us, or they're very closely related to that time. But may give and take naman eh. Like, maybe you're off by a couple of decades, pero pwede mo pa rin siyang gamitin as a primary source. Okay, once again, it's produced during the period we're studying. So they serve as first-hand evidence of what life was like, or maybe imagined to be like, such as in the case of those Chinese texts that we're going to see in the next page, by people living in that area, in that era. These can be written work, newspapers, or artifacts like jars, ships, and paintings, or even reconstructed genetic and linguistic evidence. Later, we will learn how historians critique sources for their truth value. So here's an example once again. No? Yung nakita natin kanina, itong excerpt here, it tells us that alam niyo yun, they thought that the end of Southeast Asia, the farther reaches or the parang the bottom part of the South China Sea was the end of the world. So yun yung alam nila, yun yung akala nila. Does that make it true? Not necessarily, diba? So when we look at primary sources, we're not necessarily only looking for things that are true, but for perceptions of what were true. In order for us to understand the worldview or yung mga pananaw ng mga tao na tumira sa mga panahon na iyon. So that's it. Actually, we've tackled everything we need to for academic history. So if you're able to define what that is, and if you're able to tell us what historiography is, you've met the objectives for that section. In the next segment, we're going to talk about national history, where we will also look at our course coverage and how everything fits together, the key questions we're going to use, and the arguments we're going to try to make. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.